You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. We are now a few weeks into 2025. I know, hard to believe, but we are with the passing of 2024, the Middle East finds itself in a precarious position. Much to my disappointment, the word ceasefire was not named word of the year by any dictionary, despite it being used quite extensively by US administration and international governments to describe Israel's war on Gaza, what they would like to see. But as we start the new year, the word ceasefire is, of course, being used again, and at the time of recording it seems possible that there will be a ceasefire by the time this goes out, but there may not be, and we still don't yet know the terms yet, and this day we're recording on the 14th of January. But regardless, we still have escalating situations in the West Bank. Gaza could still escalate further, and there's also the threat of escalations elsewhere in 2025. I mean, we've also got Syria, which is still getting used to post-Assad future, with HDS promising the formation of technical committees later this year. We do also, what do we think is going to happen here for Syria's future this year, and what things should we keep looking out for? Lebanon has just elected a new president, Saudi Arabia races ahead with 2030 vision, and Iranians are starting the year with rolling power cuts. So we will try to make sense of and identify the trends across the region this year. Helping us get there, I am joined by Professor Nader Hashemi. Nader Hashemi is the director of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding and an associate professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic politics at Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University. He obtained a doctorate from the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and previously was an Andrew Mellon Postdoctorate Fellow at Northwestern University and a visiting scholar professor at UCLA Global Institute. Dr. Hashemi was previously the founder and director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Josef Korbel School for International Studies at the University of Denver. His intellectual and research interests lie at the intersection of comparative politics, political theory, in particular debates on the global rise of authoritarianism, religion, democracy, secularism, and its discontents, Middle Eastern and Islamic politics, democracy, and human rights struggles in the non-Western societies, and Islam-West-related relations. He is the author of Islam and Secularism, Liberal Democracy Towards Democratic Theory of Muslim Societies, and the co-author of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle in the Future of Iran's Future, The Syrian Dilemma, Sectarianization Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East, and a 4th-volume study on Islam and human rights, critical concepts in Islamic studies. His textbook project is called The Global Divide Over Israel and Palestine. He is frequently interviewed by PBS, NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, Pacifica Radio, and BBC, and his writings have appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, The Nation, Al Jazeera Online, CNN, among other media outlets. He is also the non-resident fellow at Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn. Professor Nader Hashemi, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for the invite.
Yes, and thank you for agreeing to talk to us. I mean, this year is going to be, 2024 was a very packed year with so much happening, so many new developments. And of course, now we're entering 2025. Some of those will see the fruition of what started in 2024, and new things will soon arise. But before we sort of talk about the year ahead, looking back at 2024 itself across the region, what do you think the major developments were, and how do you think it might impact us into 2025?
Well, clearly, focusing on the Middle East region, the biggest story, which hasn't ended yet, is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Roughly, as we're speaking right now, we're into the 15th month of that moral obscenity that's unfolding, and it's unclear, how it's going to end. The morning today and yesterday is the big news is that it looks like there might be a ceasefire and hostage exchange deal on the table. This was a deal, if you're following this story, that was available and on the table at least 10 months ago. Netanyahu, for reasons that we can discuss, refused to sign on to the deal, and the Biden administration refused to establish any consequences for Netanyahu for opposing a ceasefire deal. So, looking back roughly a year ago at this moment, everyone was focused on Gaza. As we begin to look at this new year, I think Gaza is still the main story, even though other things have emerged in terms of the regional political scene. Critically, what's happened in Syria, we can talk about that. I mean, there are links here that are worth noting. And of course, the fallout from the genocide in Gaza. There's an assumption, if you just listen to the news today, that if we can only get to a ceasefire deal, then this horrific story in Gaza will be over and we can all go back to our lives. But if you know anything about what's happening in Gaza since October the 7th, 2023, Gaza no longer exists. It's been effectively vaporized, pulverized. A ceasefire deal does not end the ongoing trauma and moral obscenity that Gaza has become, because, and the day after, let's say the ceasefire deal is signed and everyone agrees to the terms, what's going to happen to the 2 million people left in Gaza? Just to cite one example, we have reports that in the best case scenario, it would take 15 years just to clear out all of the rubble that has been accumulated, and Israel wouldn't allow and won't allow cement to be imported into Gaza because they claim it will be used by Hamas for tunnels. So you basically have 2 million people living in tents who've just gone through and are victims of a genocide with no clarity on their future. They can't leave, they can't survive there. So the legacy of Gaza, but more importantly, the memory of what the Arab and Islamic world and global South has seen in Gaza over this last 15 months, largely as a result of strong, indefatigable, and ongoing support from the West. That memory is not going to go away anytime soon. Just yesterday, I saw a report where senior American intelligence officials were testifying before Congress, and they were saying that the level of anti-Americanism has been at historic heights, and that can be attributable to the situation in Gaza and the deep ripple effects that this is having on the hearts and minds of the Muslim world, 1/4 of the planet, and how this is going to have negative consequences and blowback for the West because of their complicity in this horror story. So I think, Gaza in many ways is a turning point, which is why I'm working on a new book project on this topic, because I think it's going to be something that we'll be talking about and discussing. It's one of those regional events, regional pivot points that I think marks a new set of understandings, a set of developments. The ultimate repercussions we don't know yet, but I don't think they'll be positive. They certainly won't be positive for the Palestinians, and I don't think they'll be positive for the region. The situation in Gaza will deeply destabilize an already unstable region, and I have no hope in hell that the Trump administration has any plan for the Palestinians or for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. So that's the big story of 2024. Syria is the other story, and then of course there's the ripple effects from the Gaza war. The confrontation between Israel and Iran reached new heights like we've never seen before in April of last year and October of last year, when there was an exchange of missiles and attack on each other's territory. There's of course the events in Lebanon, which are critical. Hezbollah effectively has been not obliterated, but deeply weakened because of Israeli military action supported by the United States. Hassan Nasrallah no longer exists. Key leaders of Hamas, both their internal and external leadership, no longer exist. And then, the big issue that's worth talking about is the shocking developments that happened at the end of 2024, that no one predicted, and that was the toppling of the 54-year-old House of Assad and the coming to power of Syrian rebel groups led by the HTS and Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who now goes by his birth name, Ahmed al-Shara. That's a big transformative event whose repercussions are still unclear what they mean for the broader region. I hope they mean good things for the people of Syria. I'm very much in the camp that is celebrating the demise of what is clearly one of the most brutal regimes, not just in the Middle East, but in the world in terms of its brutality and its treatment of its own citizens. I think that is a very positive development. What comes next is unclear, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
So before we sort of get into, further into ceasefire, Gaza, as well as the other issues you mentioned, such as Syria and elsewhere, you've also, mentioned the fact that, there's rising anti-Americanism in the wider world, specifically in parts of the Muslim world, because of the war in Gaza. If we think about outside of Palestine itself and outside of the direct region, so Lebanon and so on, in what ways do you see the Gaza war transforming the politics of many of these countries, like whether that's at the official level or whether that's just at the popular level? How has the last year and a bit changed the way people think about all of these issues?
Well, I think it's increased the level of anger, animosity toward the established political order in each individual country in the region, and toward the West more broadly. So I think the effect is much more dramatic and much more consequential in those countries in the region that are pro-Western, pro-American, because there is a connection between the genocide in Gaza and the fact that many of these Arab autocracies are allied with the West, and some of them have diplomatic relations with Israel. What's notable, and this is worth discussing in some greater detail, is that none of the Arab states that have diplomatic relations with Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, have severed their diplomatic relations with Israel in the context of the Gaza genocide. They've paid internally a price because many of them have clamped down on any protest, even sort of social media commentary criticizing, the lack of Arab government response to the genocide. So I think this is going to destabilize, delegitimize those regimes. We can already see one of the effects where, if you're following the story, just before October the 7th, 2023, the big news in Washington was a diplomatic effort that was taking up a lot of time and energy from the Biden administration to try and expand the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia. There was this view that was in Washington, and if you just look at the press coverage prior to October the 7th, there was this view that if we could only get Saudi Arabia to sign a diplomatic agreement with Israel, expanding the Abraham Accords, this would be a transformative moment for peace and stability in the Middle East, because Saudi Arabia, being the influential player, very rich state, home to Islam's holiest sites, if they were to normalize relations with Israel, the theory went, this would lead to a greater coordination between American allies. This would isolate Iran. This would be a moment of great celebration and euphoria. That's no longer an option. And it's no longer an option because it would be political suicide for the notorious Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to shake the hand of the person who has been in command and control of this genocide, Benjamin Netanyahu. And we have reports where, bin Salman has been saying openly that, look, I don't really care much about the Palestinians, but the problem is that 99% of my population does. Any opportunity and personal sort of commitment that he might have toward expanding the Abraham Accords would come up against a major internal public relations disaster for the Saudi royal family. Thus demonstrating right there, in this one example of the effects and the fallout of the Gaza war. I can't see any other Arab country signing on to these agreements, because it would effectively be shaking the hand of someone who presided over the genocide. So that's an important, I think, development. I think on the other side of the equation, though, and this is something that has a lot of resonance in Washington, D.C., is that notwithstanding this horrific genocide in Gaza, no Arab, pro-Western Arab state or regime has toppled. They've maintained stability, at least so-called stability, for the foreseeable future in terms of staying in power. And that's something that the United States is very proud of. And if you listen to the internal debate in Washington, D.C., they say things like, look, we've sort of weathered the storm. We still have, behind the scenes, very close coordination with our allies in the region, meaning Israel and Arab dictators. That hasn't changed. And of course, these Arab dictators and despots, publicly say to their own population that we care about the situation in Gaza, and we're trying to help as much as possible, and we're angry at Israel. But privately, they tell the U.S. Secretary of State that they want Israel to, finish the job, get rid of political Islam in Gaza, and finish this war as quickly as possible, because they don't want to see these images on their screen. So that's a development that's important to note as well.
Yeah, I think Bob Woodward's book, that sort of view came across quite strongly. And there's one section where Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, sort of said to Anthony Blinken, I don't really care for the Palestinian cause, but politically, a Palestinian state does need to exist for me politically to even consider normalization.
Right.
And he said it quite bluntly. I mean, I don't know how much to take, how seriously to take the account there, because it's not just
Woodward is considered to be quite authoritative on these issues, when he writes these things. So he has a good track record. I think that's true. That's my reading of bin Laden as well. I think it's actually much worse if sometime we were to get the internal minutes of the meetings. I think he's, a much more of a devilish figure than he has been, than he's revealed to have been on these issues. But the Woodward story makes perfect sense in terms of my understanding of bin Laden's calculations. It's bin Salman's calculations.
All these bins. No. I agree that Bob Woodward is generally regarded as authoritative. I think it more comes down to his ability to analyze what he's reading. Because when I'm reading his account, I read his book War, it felt like it was, obviously officials have to talk to him. And I sometimes feel like it was from the perspective the officials want to give of themselves. So, I was working really hard in genuine belief that this would happen.
I totally agree with that. I'm just talking about the actual, unique quotations that he's been able to get access to. The analysis and the interpretation very much does have, I think, a U.S. Democratic Party bias in terms of the narrative. So I agree with the analysis. I was referring more specifically to the reporting and the quotations that are in his books.
Yes, but that takes us, since we're talking about Republicans and Democrats now, that takes us to Trump's presidency, because he has come in, his inauguration, by the time this goes out, I think he will have been inaugurated. It's the 20th of January. And so, we've got a Trump 2 coming in, and if we recall Trump 1, it was very favorable towards Israel in most ways. I mean, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel by the US when they removed the embassy, various other things we can even pull out and think of. Now that we've got Trump 2, and we've got, obviously, there might be a ceasefire in Gaza, so maybe this wouldn't be as much of an issue, the actual ceasefire itself, but obviously there's issues around reconstruction. But we also have escalating strikes across the West Bank as well. And so what do we think a new Trump administration is going to do once we sort of get to the issue of Israel, Palestine, Gaza, West Bank more generally?
Well, I don't think Trump really has a vision or a strategy for the Middle East. He's not someone who is a career politician. He's not someone who knows much about the region. He's very much driven by his own personal ego and image. That's Trump himself. It was up to Trump. Just recall his first term, where he began the term, his first term as president, with some fiery words at the United Nations toward the North Korean dictator. And then they basically had a love affair where they exchanged letters, they had these summits, and Trump clearly was simply driven by the adulation and praise and adoration that the North Korean leader was demonstrating in these letters, and Trump sort of thrived on that. It didn't solve anything. So Trump himself has no vision. He's very much driven by his ego. I think his personal instincts with respect to the broader Middle East are very much impulsive. They're driven by, his stature and how he can improve it. They're driven by just, ignorance. He doesn't know much about the region. I think the problem with Trump, though, and we saw this in his first administration, is that almost all of his close advisors are pro-Israel hawks. Some of them aligned ideologically with Netanyahu, some of them to the right of Netanyahu. And they're the ones who, I think, shape the policies and have the president's ear, broadly speaking. So I think we can expect more of the same of those types of policies. So you mentioned moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, breaking with international law and longstanding American foreign policy. There was a formal American recognition under Donald Trump of the annexation of the Golan Heights. There was greater support for settlement activity, cutting off funding to UNRWA, the Palestinian United Nations Relief Work Agency that deals with Palestinian refugees, cutting funding for the Palestine Authority, which is actually something I support because I think they're a corrupt administration to begin with, so the less money they get, the better for Palestinians. So I think we're going to see more of those types of policies and there's no reason to think otherwise. I think that's the dominant group. So you look at all of these people who are going to be shaping U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East under Donald Trump. Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Elise Stefanik, the UN ambassador, Mike Huckabee, the American ambassador to the new American ambassador to Israel, this special Middle East envoy, Witkoff, I think his name is, who is now involved in CC. All of these people are, on the right, the extreme right of the political spectrum. There's no counterbalancing voice. So they're going to have the president's ear. And one can sort of expect, I think, more of the same in terms of more pro-Israel policy. I suspect if Israel wants to annex parts of the West Bank, Trump is going to go along with it. I don't think he has any policy or vision for Gaza. He's just going to let that sort of die a natural death. I don't see any plan or vision for, reconstruction. In fact, the only thing that we know from the Trump camp that we've heard about Gaza and reconstruction was this horrific comment by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, when he was speaking at Harvard several months ago, and he said that, look, Gaza has a lot of great waterfront property that's ripe for development. If only we can move the Palestinians out, we can sort of develop that property as a great investment opportunity and make some money. So that's the thinking that I think also reflects what Donald Trump probably thinks. The other sort of related point here about Trump's foreign policy toward the Middle East is the question of his support for going after Iran militarily. This is something that all of his hawkish advisors very much want. This is something that Israel under Netanyahu has been obsessed with for a very long time. I think very much the plan and the vision and the goal of Israel, having basically crushed Hamas, deeply weakened Hezbollah, celebrating the demise of Assad to a certain extent. Very much the plan for Netanyahu is to, in the Trump administration, try to convince Donald Trump to go after Iran in some way by striking its nuclear facilities. I think on that level, I suspect, based on what we saw from Trump's first term, Trump is going to draw a line, a red line. He's not interested in that type of, I think, military engagement. But you never know because he's completely unpredictable. So if you look back over his first term, Iran and the United States under Donald Trump from 2017 to 2021 almost went to war 3 times. The last time, most significantly, was when Trump sort of woke up and was convinced that assassinating Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, would be a good thing. He did that. It led to a cycle of events that almost led to an Iran-U.S. confrontation. In fact, I remember in early 2020, January 2020, when this cycle of events began, I went to sleep that night after Iran had fired these missiles into American bases in northern Iraq, injuring many American soldiers but not killing them, believing that we were headed to war. And I think had any American soldiers been killed in that Iranian missile strike in northern Iraq, the pressure on Trump to respond by bombing inside Iran would have been immense. There was no way he could have sort of, I think, resisted that pressure. And right around the time Trump was actually talking about, we have identified many targets in Iran, including dozens of cultural sites that were going to be targeted. And Iran was sort of using rhetoric that if we are hit by the United States, we're going to go after Tel Aviv and Dubai, basically turn the Middle East into inferno. So I can easily see that cycle reproducing itself. And then it's just, a question of one missile, one wrong decision, and you can clearly see a war taking place. I think that's very much what his advisors, his pro-Israel advisors, his hawkish Republican advisors want to see happen. Trump himself, I think, is reluctant to go there. And reportedly, if you follow the story from his first administration, he, on many occasions, was about to go to war with Iran, but it was these right-wing Republican populist talk show hosts like this guy Tucker Carlson, who's sort of like a neo-fascist sort of figure that is influential in the populist right in the United States, who convinced Donald Trump that no, this is a wrong move. This is not in our interests. There is sort of these elements that you sort of see in Trump that sort of make no sense. So just last week, Trump surprisingly, I don't know if you followed this story, he retweeted this interview with Jeffrey Sachs, who's this Columbia University professor who's very much on the left and who blames the United States for most of the problems of the world. And it was a quote. It was an interview that Sachs gave where he blamed Israel for dragging the United States into wars in the Middle East. So why would Trump, I think, retweet that? I don't think it was an accident. I think he was sending a message to Netanyahu that if you think you're going to drag me into a war with Iran, think again. That's not where I'm leaning. But you never know, because again, Trump is completely unpredictable. There is a view that you see, unfortunately, in some circles in the Arab and Muslim world, where I think that Trump is some sort of savior. And we saw this in the recent American presidential election, where there was this moment in Michigan where a group of Muslim leaders got together and brought Trump on stage and called him a man of peace, a man of a visionary, none of which is true. And they think that somehow Trump is going to be their savior. I think that's completely naive thinking. So I think if we had to predict what the incoming Trump administration's policy toward the Middle East is going to look like, it's probably going to look very similar to what we saw during the first term. Strong support for Israel, not supporting Israel's desire to attack Iran, strong support for Arab Gulf dictators. Recall during Trump's first term, the first thing that he did, the first foreign trip that he took, was to Saudi Arabia, where they rolled out the red carpet, and they were sort of thrilled that Trump had been elected. The other sort of changing development, though, this time that I think it's noteworthy is that last time Trump got elected, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had a position where they were very much in favor of the United States and Israel going to war against Iran. They were gung-ho about this. They were very thrilled about it. They were hoping Trump would do so. In 2019, when Iran attacked the Saudi oil facilities and Trump did not come to their rescue, there has been a recalculation and a reassessment by these Arab dictators toward Iran. And there now is a view that I think attacking Iran or trying to topple the regime is not in the interests of the existing authoritarian status quo in the Arab world. It's better to try and sort of work with Iran and have a more stable Middle East. So that's a changing element that's worth noting. The last time around, every time Trump would meet with MBS or MBZ, they would hear a narrative that let's go after Iran. I mean, I remember this was one moment when MBS came to the United States for his first trip as, de facto head of state. And he gave this interview in the Atlantic where he famously said that the problem with Iran today is that it's worse than Nazi Germany because Hitler just wanted to conquer Europe. And allegedly, Iran's supreme leader wanted to conquer the entire world. And he was very much into this narrative of, let's go after Iran militarily. That's not a factor now. There has been somewhat of a détente between Iran and its Arab neighbors. And so I don't think that's going to be a factor in shaping American policy like it was during the first term. That's a changing element. To what extent it makes a difference is open to dispute, but that's how I see things unfolding over the next 4 years. I would just say that in terms of U.S.-Iran relations, if we can get to the end of the next 4 years and there's not a shooting war, there's not a military confrontation between the United States and Iran, then I think we can consider ourselves lucky.
But just before we sort of get onto the question of Iran more generally, do you feel that there is even much appetite for that in Iran? Because if we look over the last year, particularly from like the summer onwards, it feels like Iran has suffered a lot of setbacks in the foreign policy front, not just Syria, which is obviously a big major one too, but also Lebanon, but also, the fact that Israel was able to strike Iran's defense systems. I mean, there's a lot of dispute right now about just how much of Iran's air defense system was taken down. I'm not sure. I mean, I keep hearing different things. Some saying it was damaged, but they still have some. It's an open question, but it feels as if, there was a slight miscalculation in a way about the type of response you give to Israel, because even with Hezbollah, you'd see this pattern where they were firing rockets towards Israel, and the idea was, this would not end until Gaza had ended. But Hezbollah did it around this calculation. We want to do it just enough to have
Right.
skin in the game,
Right.
but not to actually cause a full-on war. And that entire strategy seems to have blown up in their face. And so I'm sort of wondering, with that happening, and also what happened with Syria as well with the collapse of the regime, is there even much appetite
No, I think you're absolutely right in everything that you said. I don't think there's any appetite
for
in Iran for a war. For a war with the United States or even with Israel, because I think the fundamentally the Islamic Republic of Iran, its leaders, they want to survive, and they realize they can't fight a military war with more powerful enemies. So there's no appetite on the Iranian side, but there's a lot of appetite on the Israeli side and within the United States in the Republican Party. And now they're in power. They control, the Senate, the House, the presidency, and arguably the Supreme Court as well. So the Iranian system is meeting, I think, the Iranian political system is facing some of its most difficult moments since revolution in 1979. It's a deeply authoritarian regime. It's probably the most repressive regime moment in the history of the Islamic Republic that we've ever seen. Just last week, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights announced that Iran, over the last year, had executed close to 1,000 people. That gives Iran a distinction of being, number one in the world after China in terms of public executions. And I think that's largely a reflection of the vulnerability that the regime is facing in terms of its internal legitimacy crisis. I think it executes those people in part to send a message to civil society: be careful, we can execute at high numbers if you step out of line. And so there is a major internal political problems that the regime is facing, massive economic problems that are not going to get any better. I think there's a general realization among Iran's ruling elites that the only way out of this mess and the only way to keep the Islamic Republic of Iran afloat is to somehow now reach some sort of accommodation with the United States, hoping that will lift economic sanctions, allowing for the economy to improve, satisfying public demands for political change, etc. Recall one of the things that Trump did, again, going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, one of the first dramatic things that he did in terms of his Middle East policy was to tear up the Iran nuclear agreement and impose crippling sanctions on Iran, which are now really having a devastating effect on the average Iranian citizen, much less on the ruling elites and the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so if you follow the recent sort of developments in Iran, I think even among the office of the Supreme Leader, who's the most powerful figure, I think there's a general realization that they want to restart negotiations with the United States, that Iran is willing to make concessions over its nuclear program in exchange for economic relief. Whether there's that appetite in the United States, I'm very skeptical, because all of the foreign policy advisors that have Trump's ear are of the view that no, we have to go after Iran militarily, we have to hit it, we have to try and initiate regime change. If you listen to the rhetoric of these hawks in the United States, and also among Democrats in the foreign policy establishment, there is this sort of moment of euphoria that many of them are having, because they see it from a different perspective. They see, look, Israel is proven itself as a loyal ally. It's basically defeated Hamas. It's killed Nasrallah and deeply weakened Hezbollah. And as a result of those events, allegedly, Bashar al-Assad has toppled. If we could just get rid of Iran, then that will be sort of a home run for us. And then the Middle East will be stabilized. We won't have any more adversaries. We can sort of proceed with this, vision that we have of, ongoing, enduring Arab authoritarianism, and that would be the path forward for the United States. So that's the view of the key foreign policy advisors. There's no appetite that I can see among anyone in the United States, and that has President Trump's ear, that's going to be coming into the State Department, that's interested in diplomacy and is interested in meeting, Iran somewhat halfway in terms of trying to resolve their differences diplomatically. And so, as the famous saying goes, it takes two to tango. Now, I think on the Iranian side, there's great eagerness to engage in diplomatic negotiations with the approval of the supreme leader, who always has blocked them, or at least has always been very hesitant. But the problem now is, because of the changing of the guard here in Washington, D.C., there is no one that I can sort of discern on the American side that's interested in diplomacy, except for this one sort of hypothetical scenario where Trump himself, I think, would love to be able to sort of claim some sort of diplomatic grand bargain with Iran, where he is the one who presides over this new deal. The reason why I can't see that happening is that if you just envision that scenario, let's say Trump actually wanted to have a diplomatic deal with Iran, that would be so psychologically, emotionally, and politically shocking to all of his close foreign policy advisors, from the Secretary of State all the way down through the State Department to the United Nations, who are all, extremely hawkish on Iran. There's just no way they could stomach or even contemplate, diplomacy with Iran, when their whole worldview and vision is driven by a pro-Israel Likud narrative that believes that Iran needs to be toppled, not negotiated with. So despite Trump's, I think, personal preference to have diplomacy with Iran so that he can present himself as this great hero, for that to happen, his entire foreign policy team and much of the Republican foreign policy establishment would have to resign. So that's why I just don't see this happening, despite, I think, the eagerness on the Iran side for diplomacy now, and Trump's personal preference, for reasons of his own personal ego, to preside over some grand deal with Iran. I'm very skeptical that that's going to happen.
Yes, it seems unlikely, although if the unlikely was going to happen, it would be if Trump that's the president that does it. But that's really there'd have to be a lot of firings for that to happen.
Yeah, and I don't think he's that invested. I think what Trump will probably do is he won't be able to pull off a grand diplomatic bargain, but he might be able to, at least from my perspective and from the perspective of greater peace and stability in the Middle East, that would help democratic forces there. He might be able to restrain Israel and those hawkish Israel voices in the United States who want to go after Iran and start a war with Iran. That might be, the best case scenario that I can see, but I can't see him pulling off anything diplomatically, because it would require, support and a broad, diplomatic effort from people who just don't exist in this Republican foreign policy establishment.
So before we sort of move on to, because we're going to need to move on to Lebanon in a bit, I do have one sort of question here about Iran itself, which is that this is something we've noticed, especially in the last 15 years, that 15 years ago, Iranian political system was still authoritarian, but it was an authoritarian system which had more polarity, what I can't say, in the system. And then over the last 15 years, that's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's gotten to the point now where it's more vulnerable, partly because they've been clamping down on what plurality they did have. And so I'm sort of wondering, how did Iran become so invulnerable like this? And is this also tied to the fact that there's going to be succession at some point? Because, of course, Ali Khamenei is not getting any younger.
Yeah, those are good questions. You're absolutely right in your observation about internal Iranian politics. The political system in Iran was always able to accommodate a certain amount of public participation and inter-elite rivalry that would allow everyone to at least have a stake in the political system, to be able to sort of have some level of public debate and expression, but always within the framework of the existing constitution and under the careful supervision of the office of the supreme leader and other conservative clerics. What we saw in Iran over the last 15 years is that, when there were sort of not completely free elections, but at least fair elections in terms of the ballots reflecting public opinion within a very circumscribed sort of set of candidates that were all ideologically screened. Every time there was an election, you saw sort of the more reformist candidates getting elected. And that started to create instability in the system, because if you allowed this reformist, trend within Iran that was really sort of, came to fore in the late 1990s and then into the 2000s, that eventually, if they were allowed to implement their policies, the Islamic Republic would start to crumble from within, because basically it was a platform calling for gradual democratization, political transparency. And that's precisely why the hardline establishment cracked down very hard on preventing Iranian reformist candidates from staying in office, running for office once again, and narrowing the political space. And so in the elections that happened in 2021 that brought Ibrahim Raisi to power, basically that was a rubber stamp election where all of the candidates were severely screened. It was basically an engineered election. And I think the reason the reason for that is because the regime simply can't tolerate dissenting points of view that respond to substantive popular demands for greater openness, greater political participation, greater openness toward the West. Those are things that are very popular in Iran. Greater, rights for civil society and openness. When that did happen in Iran in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the political system started to unravel very quickly, and the ruling elites panicked and they clamped down. But now we've gotten to a point where that heavy-handed sort of hardline conservatism and imposing the domination of one conservative hardline faction on the system has now reached a dead point with respect to Iran's international relations, where Iran is under heavy sanction. There's a lot of domestic unrest. In 2022, there was a major uprising driven largely by women, but largely by young people over the question of the imposition of the hijab. At least 500 people were killed. It deeply rocked the system. And those issues aren't going away. Iran has a majority young population and who aspire to more freedoms and deeply detest, I think, the ruling regime. And so the regime is at this moment of crisis. And you're right to point to the succession, because Ali Khamenei is 86 years old. I suspect he perhaps has at most maybe 5 years left. And because the system is structured in a way that all power flows to the top, and it's the office of the supreme leader that is the all-powerful figure who appoints the head of the judiciary, the commanders of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, all of these key institutions. Who's going to be the successor to this current supreme leader will have profound implications for the future of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it's unclear who that person will be. My own prediction is that the death of Khamenei will be a key moment of crisis for the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it's unclear how things will unfold. So the regime is very much, I think, like other regimes, the Assad regime lasted for 54 years. I think it was much more draconian and authoritarian and repressive than the Islamic Republic of Iran has been and still is. I think, all authoritarian and repressive regimes are not the same. The Islamic Republic, I think, unlike the Assad regime, still does have a core base of supporters who believe in it, are willing to fight for it, are ideologically committed to it. It's a small percentage, but it's much bigger than the base of support that the Assad regime had. And so those realities are still there. but 45 years of an authoritarian regime that can't meet the needs of its own citizens eventually produces a set of political dynamics that bring about its own demise. We know this from the study of history. We know this from the study of Ibn Khaldun's theory of political change, where he talks about how an outside group, sort of motivated by a particular sort of sense of unity, come to power, and then after several generations, they become corrupt and they become out of touch, and they sort of create the conditions for their own demise. So it's unclear, what the future of Iran will be. I don't think time is on the side of the current rulers of Iran. I think they know they're living on borrowed time, but it's unclear how this is all going to transpire in the coming years. I think the system is basically internally stable to withstand the next 5 years, using the same sort of tactics of oppression and sort of carrots and sticks that it's always used. But the demise of the supreme leader will be a key moment for the future of the Islamic Republic that's worth watching.
So now let's move to sort of Lebanon, because this is an interesting dynamic now, because of course in the last few days we've seen a new president appointed and now a new prime minister, a prime minister that Hezbollah actually opposed the appointment of. And there seems to be this feeling that, it's very early days, no one knows what to make of it, but there is among some Lebanese people who I know a sort of sense of, well, maybe things might now get a little bit better, we're not sure. So what do we sort of see as the dynamics in Lebanon?
Well, I think the key story of Lebanon is really the underlying socioeconomic catastrophe that has been very much part of Lebanon's political reality for a long time. Before the Beirut sort of blast that ruined large parts of southern Beirut, I saw figures that said that 70% of Lebanese were living in poverty. The country had no functioning economy. It survived largely on remittances. It had a broken political system. It had a corrupt ruling class that wasn't willing and interested in making the right decisions that would help the majority of Lebanese. So the story of Lebanon is really a function of those elements. Now with this war that Israel launched against Lebanon as a result of Hezbollah's sort of attacks after October the 7th, there's been more devastation, more poverty, more destruction. So I think the key story of the future of Lebanon will really be a question of whether this new government that's coming into power, that is at least aligned with Saudi Arabia and supported by the West, will be able to bring about any of the transformations, the political, social, and critically the economic transformations that Lebanon desperately needs. So I view sort of the story of Lebanon and the future of Lebanon from that sort of bottom-up perspective, not whether Hezbollah is in power or out of power. I actually do hope that this new government is given a chance to help the needs of the vast majority of Lebanese who are, broken, living in despair, and living in poverty. Whether that's a possibility or not, it remains to be seen. But we'll have to just watch and see. So I'm less interested in whether the axis of resistance is in power in Beirut, or whether some alternative to the axis of resistance is in Beirut, whether it's the May 14th coalition, the March 14th coalition, and the March 7th coalition and their allies. I'm more interested in whether Lebanon can start to have a functioning political system that would then help, the vast majority of Lebanese who are struggling and living day to day. That's where I think the big story is, and that remains to be seen.
So let's now turn to the Gulf itself. I mean, obviously, we're now in 2025. We're about 5 years off from the sort of crescendo, if you want to call it that, of the Mohammed bin Salman's 2030 vision. We have obviously dynamics developing in Saudi, UAE, and so on. So in terms of what we think is going to happen in 2025, what do you think are the important issues facing the Gulf?
Well, I think the question of the Gulf is very much the story of whether this economic vision and development plan in Saudi Arabia can bear fruit and bring to Saudi Arabia and its citizens the types of sort of rewards that the House of Saud hopes it will, in terms of entrenching the the political system and the economic system with greater sort of stability and roots. I don't see any grand changes taking place in the Gulf. It's going to be very much business as usual. I think these Gulf leaders are very thrilled by the fact that Trump has gotten elected, because the last time around Trump was very pro-Gulf monarchy. He had his closest relations with them. So I think it's going to be business as usual. I think the Gulf political leaders are very worried about what they're seeing happening in Syria. Because if you know the story about, Arab authoritarianism and political Islam, for roughly the last 45 years, all of these authoritarian regimes invested heavily in trying to delegitimize the idea of political Islam as being a viable alternative to the existing political order. And watching events in Syria, where you have a rebel group driven by a particular political Islamist ideology, in this case, a deeply conservative Salafi jihadi ideology in terms of its intellectual formation, but toppling an Arab dictator, coming into an Arab capital and seizing power, that's a very unsettling image for Arab dictators that I think deeply scares them and shocks them. And you can sort of see that reaction from the Emirates and critically in Egypt, where they're very unhappy with that situation. And they want to see whether they can sort of, I think, bring this new political system, and particularly this figure of Ahmed al-Shara, under their sort of umbrella to make sure that his independence and the model of governance that he is proposing for the Arab region does not have negative repercussions on the rest of the Arab world. I think that's a big concern for them. I think, one of the realities of Syria, which we haven't had a chance to talk about, is that Syria is so completely devastated from war, from political repression, and from just lack of basics, the basic infrastructure that is needed to sustain life, that it's going to take a very long time for a Syria's political system to get up and running. But I think one of the good things, if you do have a political system in Syria that is at least semi-democratic, open, has a free press of some sort, allows other Arab and Muslim intellectuals to travel to Damascus, to participate in meetings, to have some sort of a fixed civil society that is open and functioning. That's a very bad example that the Gulf states don't want to see, because they very much, for a very long time, but especially after the Arab Spring, were invested in this narrative that, look, Arabs can't have democracy, the Muslim Brotherhood and any sort of organized political representation that comes out of a political Islamist spectrum is bad news. The only model is authoritarianism. And of course, recall that just before the demise of Bashar al-Assad, the Emirates and the Arab League were in the process of welcoming back Bashar al-Assad into their fold, and thought that he was going to be the man of the future. So I think that's going to be the biggest concern, and I suspect there's going to be efforts to contain, disrupt, delegitimize the situation in Syria so it moves in the direction of the image and the view that these Arab dictators in the Gulf very much want to see, which is why precisely I'm cautiously optimistic about the events in Syria, because I think it does hold the promise and the potential of something better that will be good, obviously, first and foremost for the people of Syria, but also have this sort of demonstration effect because of where Syria is located and its ripple effect across the rest of the region. That's something that I'll be watching very closely, and I think the Arab dictators in the Gulf will be watching very closely, but from a very different ideological perspective than myself, because I think they want to see a very different future for Syria than I do in terms of its ability to build a representative political system that can meet the needs of its people, and then act as perhaps a magnet and an example for the rest of the Arab world that could then follow that type of political system that would be very different from the horror story that we saw in Syria under the House of Assad.
So lastly, now thinking about the region more generally, 2025, what issues and developments do you think we should all keep an eye out on?
Well, Syria is a big story. What happens in Syria? Where the Syrian political experiment goes. I am very worried that there's going to be a consolidation of political power in Damascus under the HTS, and eventually, to maintain political power, they're going to have to use coercive measures. That's just the logic of statecraft, and so I'm very worried about this timeline that has been proposed, what this actually means for the future of Syria. And I'm very worried that this moment which is still a very ripe moment, a new moment, we're just a month after the demise of Assad, that the political space is going to close in Syria. So the future of Syria will have, I think, is something to watch for. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of hope, but there's also a lot of concern over where Syria is headed. So that's something I think is going to be a big story. Then I think in 2025, the whole question of the future of Gaza. So even if we get to a ceasefire, what's going to happen to the 2 million people in Gaza? What will their future be? It doesn't look like they have a future. They certainly don't have homes to go back to. And the situation in Gaza, as everyone knows or should know, was horrific prior to October the 7th, 2023. Now it's just catastrophic. So I think the future fate of the people of Gaza, the future consequences of this genocidal moment in the Middle East as a result of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians, backed by the West, and let's not forget, and I want to highlight this, also backed by the Arab authoritarian regional order. They're deeply complicit in the story of Gaza. The implications and the ripple effects of, the Gaza genocide on the politics of the region, that's going to be, a big story. And then finally, there's the question really of Iran, because as I said a moment ago, there's going to be voices in the Trump administration that very much wants to continue this forward march of going after the axis of resistance, having crushed Hamas, weakened severely Hezbollah, got rid of Assad, and now Iran is next in line. That's very much, the Netanyahu, Likudnik, Republican Party playbook. What's going to happen with U.S.-Iran relations? That's going to be, I think, an important story to follow. I'm not optimistic that we're going to see any success for diplomacy, but it's going to be a moment of key tension that will revolve around Iran's nuclear program and enrichment, and fears that if Iran does get a nuclear weapon, that's going to be the end of the world, as is often said in the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the Israeli political establishment. So that's going to be a big development. And then the other sort of point that I would just end on is that I think the deeper story in the region that doesn't get the attention that it deserves, because it's not sort of a dramatic moment that generates headlines, is really the ongoing story of the consistent and persistent mass poverty and mass pauperization of ordinary citizens throughout the region, living under repressive regimes, suffering economically, trying to make ends meet. On top of all of the problems and challenges that they're facing, there is an exacerbating set of factors, of which I'd point to environmental destruction as a new added layer that's impoverishing people and pushing people to extreme measures just to survive. That story is a long-standing story, has deeper roots. I don't see that story as going away anytime soon. Unfortunately, in terms of the international focus on the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, the Emirates get a lot of attention as if that's representative of the broader Middle East and North Africa, where it's not. I think the vast majority of people in the region are struggling to survive, and that's not going away. And the last element is that I would just say is the whole role of Turkey. Turkey is, now the big winner in Syria. It has the most influence as an external actor. And with Iran being weakened, I think that's eventually going to set up a clash and deeper tensions between Israel and Turkey over the future of the Middle East. I don't see that going away anytime soon. That's something to watch for in terms of the future of 2025 in the Middle East.
Nader Hashemi, thank you for talking to us on MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for the opportunity. I enjoyed it.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you missed this one and would like to catch up with it or see previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations. brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.